The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the very first day of this 7-day sesshin here in March 2021 in northern New Mexico at Mountain Gate. And I'd like to share with you during this entire sesshin something of the life and teachings of a favorite person of mine, Muso Soseki. He was born in 1275, a little more than 20 years after the death of Dogen, and at a time when there were still Chinese priests coming to Japan to teach and to introduce Buddhism to the Japanese, and also Japanese going to China, as Dogen himself did. Muso Soseki was born to a very high-class family. He was something like the 9th generation from one of the emperors, and his family was very powerful. But his mother died when he was 3. So power doesn't necessarily mean a lot in a person's life. But he was a precocious child and very sensitive. And this played out through his entire life. This is one of the reasons why I find a connection to him, that and the fact that he's buried at Rinzenji, where I spent many, many days in silent retreat, solo retreat in Kyoto, thanks to the generosity of Yuho, who was the sole monk there, and also the okay of the then abbot of Tenryuji. Tenryuji is the headquarters temple of, or one of the many 14 headquarter temples of the Rinzai sect in Japan. And it is a major temple. It's currently still a teaching temple, unlike some of them. And Rinzenji, where Muso Soseki is buried, is these days considered the founder's hall of Tenryuji. Rinzenji was also founded by Muso Soseki, and as I said, he was buried there. He also did the original garden there, although that original garden no longer exists. It's a very different garden, apparently. In fact, Muso Soseki was famous as a gifted garden designer and designed the garden at Rinzenji, the garden at Tenryuji, the moss garden at Saihoji, and a number of other very famous gardens in Japan. And because of the intervening unrest, including civil war, between Muso Soseki's time and the later generations, these gardens were largely destroyed and then rebuilt many years later, and apparently after he died. But he died in an era when people were buried in Japan. Nowadays, people are cremated because there simply is not enough room to bury everybody. But in those days, they did bury people, and he is buried underneath, quite a bit underneath, I believe, because it's a rather high structure of the Founders Hall part of the building that is considered the Founders Hall of Tenryuji. And his exquisitely beautiful, compassionate energy fills the place. It's quite amazing. I was drawn there many, many times. Atop this platform, large platform, there are great big steps, as is typical in Japan, going up to this high platform, and a life-size statue of him is sitting in a chair in his robes. And in fact, you can see this statue. There's a picture of it right here on the cover of this book called Dialogues in a Dream, which is a translation of one of his major works. He was known for that beautiful energy. At the time during his life, there were a number of situations, political situations, where there was a great deal of unrest and friction, particularly between two samurai brothers one of whom became shogun, and they would at times support each other, and other times were at odds. The Ashikaga brothers, Takeuchi and Tadayoshi. And he somehow managed to bring them together whenever there was dispute, and there were many disputes. And he was known for his diplomatic abilities, only they weren't really called diplomatic abilities. It was the apparent fact that he was such a wonderful human being, such a compassionate and non-judgmental, perhaps, human being, that he was famous for being able to bring warring sides together in at least temporary peace. He's also considered the student of 7 emperors, 7 different emperors, beginning with, I believe, Emperor Go-Daigo, who was emperor at the time that the Ashikaga shogunate was in place, and that was another piece of friction there. And 6 other emperors gave him the title of the emperor of the national teacher. He was, as I said, the most famous Zen priest in his time in Japan, and he lived to be 77 years old. He was dedicated to his practice. And not only was he dedicated to his practice, but he was quite humble in it. For example, later in his life, when he actually was teaching, he went back to visit one of his main teachers, and the teacher asked him if he would become the head monk at his monastery, and he did. And I think about many, many years ago in Rochester when I was working on koans, and I was, of course, friends with other people working on koans. We were all there together at the Rochester Zen Center. And every once in a while, Mitra-roshi would put somebody back on a fundamental koan, a breakthrough koan. There are quite a few breakthrough koans, well, at least a handful. The most famous of which, of course, is Mu. Does a dog have the Buddha nature? No. Well, the Buddha said, everything has the Buddha nature. So how come Joshu, who is a phenomenal teacher, highly regarded, even now, centuries later, one of the stars of the Tang Dynasty Chinese teachers of Buddhism, how could he say no if the Buddha said yes? And of course, they're both right at the same time. Then there is the koan that came out of the 6 patriarchs experience, where after he had been training at the 5th patriarch's temple, he was given the robe and the bowl and made the 6th patriarch and told to get out of there as fast as possible because his life would be in danger. And so he took off through the forest which he was quite familiar with, having grown up living in the forest, and not that forest, but forest. And eventually he was come upon finally by the leader of the group of monks that set out to go after him and get the robe and the bowl back, assuming that he had stolen it. And that monk had been supposedly a general in his pre-monk life, and was unable to lift the robe and the bowl when it was there for him to be able to take away if he wanted it to. And so he broke out into a cold sweat and asked the fifth patriarch, or the sixth patriarch, please, I didn't come for the robe or the bowl, I came for the teaching. Will you please teach me? And so Huineng, who had hidden behind a bush when he realized that Monk Myo was coming, said, okay, let's do some zazen first. And so they sat zazen. And after a certain point, Huineng said to him, when you were pursuing me, thinking of neither good nor evil, where then was your original face, the face before your parents were born? And so that's another koan. And a key there is when you were thinking of neither good nor evil. Many, many ancient masters have emphasized the point that Zazen and Zen practice and coming to awakening, the possibility of coming to awakening, is independent of words and cannot be reached through words. And so when Monk Myo was just so fully 100% focused on tracking the sixth patriarch, he was able to come to awakening through sudden recognition of that. So that's another one. That's a major one. And then, of course, there is the Hakuin's favorite koan for breakthrough, which is the sound of one hand. And we all know what two hands sounds like, but how can one hand make a sound? Well, I suppose you could slap it on the table or something, but what is the sound of one hand? And don't get caught in your ideas about it. And then there is a more modern version of all of these koans, which all point to the same thing, which is, who am I? And periodically, a teacher will send a student back, even though they've been working on subsequent koans, having technically had a breakthrough. They will send a student back to a different one of the breakthrough koans. And depending on how deeply a student has opened, they will either be fine with that or they'll find themselves insulted. And if they find themselves insulted, then they definitely need to work on that second breakthrough koan, because they have not gone deep enough. Muso Soseki understood the need to continue practice, regardless of how old he was, regardless of how far he'd gotten in his training, regardless of how many kensho he had. He simply understood that, and that expresses a rather deep understanding that someone is willing to continue working on himself. And this is something that the greatest teachers have always done. It's something that has gotten lost to a certain degree in modern Zen, unfortunately, but hopefully it is coming back. We certainly emphasize it here. So Muso Soseki, at 3, his mother died. And in those days, parents died, siblings died frequently early on. And it just was the nature of things back then, way before antibiotics and so on and so forth. Dogen's mother died also, but he was 8 years old, I believe that at that time. And his father had died also when he was 3. So whether or not these early and prominent deaths had an impact on these two exemplary teachers moving into Buddhist practice or not, when it's hard to think that they didn't. Muso Soseki, and by the way, his name is not what he was given as an ordained monk. He was ordained at age 16, I believe, at Todaiji in Nara, the temple that's famous for the great, huge Buddha. But before that, he also was taken to a temple when he was 8. He'd already shown predisposition for Buddhist practice. In fact, apparently 7 days of mourning for his mother, and it doesn't say quite when that was, whether it was immediately after his mother died or whether it was an annual remembrance. He, for 7 days, chanted the Lotus Sutra as a child. And this happened before his father took him to a temple. And the temple that he was taken to live and train at was not a Zen temple. It was a Tendai temple, I believe. And so his early training was in the Tendai teachings and the exoteric and esoteric teachings, which many, many decades later, he said, when somebody urged him to go back to Tendai, he said, Tendai and Zen have nothing in common. There's no meeting place. And he trained, and he continued to train. And then at a certain point, he had a dream. I think he was 19 years old, something like that. He had a dream, and this is where his name comes from. He had a dream in which an elderly monk led him to a couple of different temples. And out of those temples, he put the two names together and came up with Soseki. They were actually the names of some ancient Chinese masters. And at the end of the dream, this elderly monk had taken a scroll from the second temple that they visited, handed it to Muso Soseki, and said, please take good care of this. And he took that dream as an indication that he needed to shift to Zen, because these were Zen masters that those temples were named after. And so at that point, he changed his name. Soseki was the combination of the two temple names. And Muso was dream, it's a dream entrance, indicating that the dream had moved him in a different direction. And so he began to study Zen. And he first studied with a Chinese teacher, Yixing Yining in Kyoto, I think, at Kennichi. And then there was this dialogue after a certain point. He kept trying to figure out how to come to awakening. And he kept asking Yixing. And here is what Yixing said. If we can get to the right page. I should mention also that there was something that really moved him to change from Tendai. And I'll share this out of this book, Dialogues in a Dream, Muchu Mondo, that was translated by Thomas Yuho Krishner. Muso's spiritual life took a decisive turn in 1293 when one of the priests teaching Tendai doctrine in Heienji became ill and shortly thereafter died in a state of great suffering. This painful death caused Muso to question the entire direction of his education. And according to his biography, Muso reflected that, quote, Buddhism has many paths, but all are directed toward leaving the world's dust behind and gaining the way. This lecture master was famous for his knowledge, but at the time of his death, it had benefited him nothing. The Buddha Dharma is beyond the reach of learning and intellect. Is it not for this reason that the Zen school speaks of, quote, a separate transmission outside the teachings, close quote? And so that motivated him to shift from Tendai to Zen. I'd like to interject here a poem that he wrote, which underscores this whole thing. It's called Beyond the World, and it was translated into English by W.S. Merwin, who was a Zen student, I think, of Robert Aiken. This place of wild land has no boundaries, north, south, east, or west. It's hard to see even the tree in the middle of it. Turning your head, you can look beyond each direction. For the first time, you know that your eyes have been deceiving you. This place of wild land has no boundaries, north, south, east, or west. Is this not our true nature? Turning your head, you can look beyond each direction. And this is what we work to do with our breath, is to look beyond, look beyond, look beyond. This is a fundamental deepening practice for Zen students. We have this wonderful extended out breath, the Sosokan. And as we extend that out breath sufficiently, we have to, as you've heard so many times, let everything else go in the meantime. And we're not trying to go into a place of blankness with it. We are going into a place of such total presence that it is aliveness that we are going into. And within that aliveness, as Muso Soseki says, there is no north, south, east, or west, no boundaries. And when you turn your head, you can look beyond. And this is what we're seeking to do through this extended out breath, is looking beyond what we ordinarily see, feel, hear, think. Because what we see, hear, feel, and think is rather superficial. So what is beyond seeing, hear, thinking, and feeling? As we continue to do our practice, doing it in this way will take us deeper. When we're working on a koan, for example, we're not simply repeating the words of the koan to ourselves. In fact, if you're doing that, you're keeping yourself way above where you need to be in order to effectively practice. It is the perplexity that's expressed by this koan. How can a dog have the Buddha nature and not have the Buddha nature at the same time? How can you in this life have the same life previously, your original face, when we die, doesn't the body decay? Doesn't that face that we have in this life simply melt away? So how can we talk about an original face? What is this original face? And how can you get a hand out of this without doing something with it that makes a sound? That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about the sound of the hand itself. So it's the perplexity of these koans that is most important, fundamental in terms of the practice. And when we put that perplexity into the extended out breath, which basically it's called cutting away, but it's not like you're actively cutting something, you're more letting it go. Any alternative distractions. And if you find yourself able to multitask while you're doing the extended out breath and you're not doing it properly, in order to do it properly, everything is let go, at least for the period of the breath. And you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. It is described as like overlapping fish scales. One breath goes all the way out, comes back in naturally, goes right away, back out again, as far as you can send it out. And of course, part of that process is feeling the experience of breathing out in your body, and with that perplexity riding on that physical experience. In this way, you are going to take your practice very, very deep. We have to forget ourselves momentarily, at least, in order to have an awakening experience. In my own years of practice, in the early years, I was able to move suddenly forward faster when one day it was before I was actually living at the Rochester Zen Center, and I had moved from overseas because I knew I had to go somewhere where I would have to practice because I didn't have the self-discipline to do it on my own. And I was drawn to the Rochester Zen Center, partly because I knew somebody who was a member there, but that wasn't the only thing. There was some draw. And initially, I was not accepted to live at the center right away. In fact, it was, I moved in November 1976. I'd already been practicing for some time. And it wasn't until the following year in August that I was accepted to live at the Rochester Zen Center. In the meantime, in those days, the Rochester Zen Center was offering training programs. You had to pay for them. And so I used what money I still had to buy myself succeeding training programs. And in between, I lived in what was in those days called Sangha House. Everybody was in their early 20s. I was in my early 30s at that point, but everybody else was in their early 20s and happy to be practicing. And so Rochester Zen Center was in an old section of town, a very elegant at one time, old section of Victorian houses. And these great big houses were often rented by a group of Sangha members. And we would each pay for a room and then share expenses, share cleaning, share a kitchen, share bathrooms, and so on. And so for $12 a month, I could have a room, and it was only 2 blocks away from the Zen Center. So I walked to every morning and evening sitting. I had no vehicles at the time. Eventually I got a bicycle, but it was years before I got a car. And one morning, and Rochester has got dreadful weather. It's nasty in the winter, alternately freezing and thawing, and many, many people, including my great-grandfather, break bones in the winter from slipping and falling on the ice. And it's also pretty dreary in the daytime. It's located very close to one of the Great Lakes, and it is prone to what they call lake effect weather, which means a lot of snow in the winter and rain a lot of the rest of the time. And that is exactly why Mitra-roshi set up shop there, because he felt like if it wasn't very nice to be outside, people would be more willing to go inward. And so I was walking one morning, early morning, to a morning sitting, and the sidewalk was littered with fallen branches and so on, and mud. And somehow I caught the edge of one branch in the instep of one shoe, and somehow it got connected into the instep of the next shoe, the other shoe, and I was going to trip, and I almost fell down, but I was so electrified by the attempt to avoid falling down that something clear happened. It is not at all a kensho, by the way. It was just some letting go of anything else in the moment because of the shock of maybe I was going to go down and in the mud. It was kind of funny because when I went to Doksan later that day and I told Mitra-roshi I tripped, and he said, "You mean you took drugs?" No, I didn't take drugs, Roshi. Yeah, but it was an era when people did a lot of that. So, and that there was something similar that happened to Muso Soseki that actually triggered a kensho for him. He had, let me see if I can find this in this book. There are many, many wonderful things he says here. Said, even the Buddhas and the patriarchs cannot explain original nature, but if one perseveres in clarifying it, one cannot fail to understand. Thus, one must take every opportunity to practice. Still, desire for the way cannot overcome the feelings. When the mind moves, one loses oneself in the surrounding circumstances. Thus, from today, I will make no distinction between self and circumstances. As the Buddha said, waking and sleeping are the same. Remembering and forgetting are one. And let's see if we can find this place. Okay. Nope, that's not it either. Well, what happened was he was doing meditation in a strange place, and there was a building, and he was doing it outside the building, and he'd been doing it for a long time, and he got up to rest. It was dark by then. Got up and went to rest, just leaning against a wall in the building, and the wall wasn't there. There was no wall there, and he fell. And in that falling, it was a more intense version, obviously, of my adventure with the stick on the street in Rochester. And he actually had a kensho experience. But that didn't stop him. He kept on going after that. He did many, many years of practice alone. He also did many, many years of practice under particularly his main teacher at Kennichi. He did train for something like 8 years under Yixing, the Chinese master, at that temple, and then went to his successor and trained again with him. So he put in many, many, many years of formal training, and also he did many years of solo retreat. He continued to deepen himself immeasurably. And as I said, he was known for his ability to harmonize people. And the Ashikaga brothers, who were samurai, and one of them actually made himself shogun, and the other sort of was a support. And at the same time, the Emperor Go-Daigo was the emperor, but then they deposed the emperor, and the brothers quarreled and got into fighting with each other and so on and so forth. But each time, Muso Soseki was able to pour oil on the waters many, many times. And so he gained a reputation for being a great harmonizer. He was able to be appreciated and honored by opposing factions. Normally, in those days, at least, if he was supporting the wrong faction, he would have been killed. But instead, they honored him. This is something that can take place for all of us, because there is an innate compassion and wisdom within each one of us. And when that is manifest, everything in our environment changes. This is one of the products of deep Zazen. And this is also an important aspect of what's called the long maturation, that we continue working on ourselves. Because as we have a Kensho experience, and then another one, and then another one, and you've heard that Hakuin had 19 major Kensho experiences and countless minor ones before his final Kensho, when he was in his 50s, and he started practicing when he was 7 or 8 years old. And that's when finally he found he no longer had any anxiety or any discomfort. Everything eased for him, despite the fact that he'd had 18 previous Kensho experiences and had found some relief in each one of them. You may know that Hakuin started practice out of fear that he was going to fall into hell. And that fear of falling into hell stayed with him for a very long time. Practice is something that we do for a long time, because there's always deeper to go. And it's always worth going deeper. And in addition to that, as we continue to go deeper, we see increasingly where we are caught and where we have indulged in less than optimal behavior. And there is a chance then to change that, to let those dysfunctional behaviors go. We can't do it until we see them. And this is one of the aspects of practice that sometimes concerns people, because in the early years of practice, we're sort of in a honeymoon period. It's kind of cool to be doing Zen practice. And then some of the shit begins to hit the fan. And we can come to the conclusion that we're not doing the practice right, or that we're bad people, or we got to do something different, some other practice. Forget Zen. Let's try yoga or something. And unfortunately, that's a sad decision to make, because the fact that we are getting uncomfortable and seeing more clearly our behavior, which is not what we really recognize, is the chance to do something about it, to live a more harmonious life, to engage in more compassion and wisdom in our behavior instead of our old habit patterns that we grew up with, most of which are culturally imposed and not necessarily very useful and often pain producing. We can't do anything about them until we can see them. So, as Shunryu Suzuki said when he was talking about the same thing, he said at a certain point in practice, these mind weeds start coming up, and you can use them as manure to fertilize your practice. And that's exactly what we can do. And that's exactly what Muso Soseki did as well. So this is just an introduction to this amazing man. And I will share tomorrow some of his teachings, and through sesshin, hopefully as well. In the meantime, I hope you are inspired to practice yourself deeper by his example, because it's amazing what you can realize. And it is not an easy process. I was reading not so long ago about as people grow older, their cognitive abilities begin to slow down. And there are things that you can do about that, but people don't want to do them because it takes effort. And the thing is, practice takes effort. But nothing that doesn't take effort really has any lasting results. And Zazen, if you open to and embrace whatever seems to be there in the moment, it's amazing how beneficial this can become. The last thing we want to do is try to shove it out under the carpet again, because here's our chance to become free of whatever that behavior is. And in the process of it, to expand our awareness, expand our innate compassion and wisdom, and continue the process of unfolding into the very best person we are already, but which is covered over by conditioning and history. So keep on going. It makes such a difference. It makes such a difference. And I thank you for listening. I'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.